Welcome to our show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Really, really looking forward to the conversation.
So we've been sampling some of your podcasts as preparation for this. And
Fantastic. Wow, that means a lot coming from you guys. Thank you.
and you have this series of posts, right? Where in the world is Ari? It's a bit like Where's Waldo? So where are you today?
Yeah, no, it's been super fun and a great way to kind of engage people, all over who are thinking about, cryptocurrency and regulation in our space. But today, where in the world is Ari? I am home in Washington, D.C., which is so nice. And I think probably something my wife is grateful for and has put me to work here. But yeah, no, it's Washington, D.C. is home, has been for a long time, and nice to be home every once in a while.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like you've been all over the world in the last few weeks.
Yeah, I have, and it's really, I think it's interesting. There's so much going on globally when it comes to
Mm,
sort of crypto regulation, crypto policy, sort of working with law enforcement and regulators globally. I was in Korea a week or so ago, sort of talking to
mm.
policymakers there. We were co-hosting a day-long conference with Ripple, and sort of just engaging with folks there from really across the spectrum, private sector, law enforcement, regulators. But really, that model is happening everywhere in the world, right? You're having
Mm.
all of this engagement in the space, and that's really sort of why the traveling has become a thing, because crypto is not local. The whole nature of the technology, cross-border value transfer at the speed of the internet. There are no
Mm.
borders. And almost it's like that's the lifestyle you adopt when it comes to this space.
Your background wasn't in crypto, right? It wasn't in the tech world. Tell us a little bit about your professional background.
No, it's been a really sort of wild adventure the last couple of years. But yeah, no, I am a prosecutor by training. I spent about 11 years at the U.S. Department of Justice,
Mm,
specifically the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia,
mm,
and there I really sort of focused much of that time on that intersection between money laundering and national security, what we call threat finance. So whenever
mm,
bad guys, anywhere in the world were trying to use money to do bad things, that was sort of our jam. So terrorist financing, export control, sanctions, criminal
mm,
prosecutions, money laundering investigations. And then, after my time as a prosecutor, I went over to the U.S. Treasury Department and sort of kept doing that same type of work, right? Focused on illicit actors in the financial system. I worked for the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, and that's the role that oversees OFAC, which is the US sanctions regulator, FinCEN, which is our financial intelligence unit, and really the sort of
mm.
national security apparatus within Treasury. So yeah, it is definitely a different background than most folks. People say, how did you get into crypto? And for me, it's, hey, I was, doing investigations of North Korea money laundering and
Mm.
cryptocurrencies early days, right? It's definitely a different than the most of the conversations you have, but super, super interesting path into the space.
So you were knee deep as a prosecutor and then in Treasury in threat finance, as you sort of wonderfully called it, summarized threat finance. And crypto, to the layperson, seems like it's full of bad actors engaging in what would have been previous beat as threat finance. Why does crypto come across as just just overflowing with bad actors, or are we giving are we giving crypto a sort of bad rep here?
Yeah, no, I think so. And it's interesting. Like any emerging technology, any new technology, illicit actors are going to
Mm,
take advantage of it. And it's interesting. I said a few minutes ago, just sort of the nature of cryptocurrencies, right? Cross-border value transfer at the speed of the
yeah.
internet. Make it attractive to illicit actors who want to move large amounts of funds faster than ever before. But I think what's often missing from the conversation is the ability to sort of follow financial flows in crypto in ways that were unimaginable before. When
Mm,
I was a prosecutor, I used to do cases involving, networks of shell companies and hawalas and, bulk cash smuggling and high value art and real estate. Like there's no TRM, right, for those things. You can't track and trace funds in those things. So I think you have this interesting paradox when it comes to crypto, and that is you can move funds faster and in larger amounts than ever before. But at the same time, we have more visibility on open blockchains than we've ever had before for financial crime investigation, for regulation, for compliance professionals at financial institutions. So it's this really interesting paradox. But I think sort of at the end of the day, crypto is not a great way to launder funds.
So is crypto like every emerging technology or every emerging business model that you could look back over the last several centuries? And in those early days, you get, dreamers and speculators and chancers and risk takers and bad guys and bad girls. And is it just like the latest iteration, or is there something specific like that seems to attract? Because this is not just an innovation, right? It's about transfer of value, as you put it. It's about money. Is that something specific around that makes it sort of so like, I don't know, interesting, the space to bad guys?
Look, I think it's right. I think for in terms of bad guys, I think it's this ability to transfer value in just larger amounts faster than ever before, right? You
Yeah.
could send a huge ransom payment in cash or gift cards, or
Mm,
the way you can in crypto. But that said, look, I mean, I think that like there's certainly a speculative aspect to our industry today that I think gets a lot of the press. But at the end of the day, I think the promise of the technology is
mm,
this ability to transfer value, to really sort of every corner of the world, right? This idea that anyone with a cell phone can do peer-to-peer value transfer, without banks, without intermediaries. And I think that's sort of the true promise of this. I think we have definitely been bogged down early days around sort of the speculative nature of the technology, as opposed to sort of the real promise here of value transfer. And I think we'll see how this plays out. But like anything else, like any nascent industry, you're going to have
mm,
sort of folks who are speculators and risk takers sort of early on. And I think that what we're seeing is sort of a coalescence around sort of larger players potentially, or at least sort of more stability in the space. And I think we'll see that
mm.
play out. But we are sort of at that early birthing stage, and it could be ugly at times. There's absolutely no doubt.
I don't know if your wife or your spouse or your parents are into crypto. When you first told them you were getting involved in the space, what did they say? Have you gone to work with the bad guys, or what did they say? You're a prosecutor. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, I think quite the opposite. It's interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
TRM, we definitely sort of live in this sort of very interesting world in
Mm,
sort of the crypto ecosystem where, I think family and friends kind of always knew that my focus was on, stopping bad guys. And to be able
yes.
to kind of take that, almost 15-year career of doing that,
Yeah.
in the government to a startup, on a mission to build a safer financial system is
Mm,
really sort of the coolest thing ever. I think more of what I got was like, so wait, you're doing what? You're going to a 9-person startup that does crypto, right? Like, you know, and um, and,
yeah.
and I think at the end of the day, it's sort of a leap of faith, not
Yeah.
just about the space, which is something I do strongly believe in, the
Mm,
technology, decentralized finance, but also sort of, building a startup, which is obviously sort of a very new experience to being part of that journey. Um,
oh,
and so yeah, so a little bit of everything. I will say that it's the family's all in at this point. I don't know, like you
yeah.
mentioned some of like the videos and the podcast stuff. I've definitely done some fun ones with where they're getting involved in what we're doing, and it's it is. I think it's the nature of an early stage startup and just being in a
Mm.
really cool space with just amazing people.
So how did you explain what TRM does to your family in terms of
Yeah.
like, and to the audience who are listening to this who maybe aren't crypto specialists or forensic analysis specialists, how would you explain what TRM does?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I feel like I'm constantly repeating it to my parents when they're just like
Yeah.
going to dinner with friends or something. But look, I think a couple different pieces to
Yeah.
this. We're anti-money laundering for crypto.
Right.
So whether that means we're working with law enforcement to track and trace the flow of funds using
Mm,
our software, whether it means we're working with regulators to kind of understand what are the risks within their regulated ecosystem, or finally,
Mm,
whether we're working with, cryptocurrency businesses or financial institutions to be their compliance tool for anti-money laundering.
mm,
So, I think we're a number of different things to a number of different types of users. But at the end of the day, it's anti-money laundering for crypto, ensuring that people
mm.
are engaging or entities are engaging with the cryptocurrency ecosystem safely.
And how do you execute that? How do you put that into practice? How does TRM put that into practice?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's all about data, right? Like,
Mm,
when someone's going to engage in the crypto economy, they want to have the best data to make the right
mm,
decisions. So what we're
yep.
basically doing is we are creating an enormous database of
Mm,
of labeled addresses. So in other words, if you are going to engage with a terrorist financier or a sanctioned Russian oligarch or a
mm,
North Korean cyber criminal, we want to make sure that that address is labeled as such. So you are engaging. If you are a cryptocurrency business, if you're an exchange, you want to make sure that that you're engaging with that type of entity. So what we're doing is we're taking all that raw blockchain data, right? That
mm,
alphanumeric string of identifiers, and we are labeling it with threat intelligence. We're not saying, hey, that's Ronit's address. What we're saying
mm,
is that address belongs to a terrorist financier or a sanctioned entity. And how do we know that? We're out there.
mm-hmm.
We're out there, on the web, in the places you need to be able to sort of build out that attribution. So if we see, Mujahideen raising funds on Facebook or Twitter, right? They have a sign that says donate to this address. We take that
Yes.
address and we put it in our tool, in our software, and we label it terrorist financing. So if you're a cryptocurrency business or a financial institution and you're going to engage with that address, you know that it's a terrorist financier.
And so it sounds like it's very labor intensive work, like going through internet address or blockchain wallet or crypto wallet one by one. How do you like automate or scale this type of work?
Yeah, no,
It sounds like I'm wandering around like I don't know, the Library of Congress, like literally just marking books one by one.
I love that. I love that analogy. And what we use is Google Maps. Sometime we'll
Yep.
show like a totally blank Google map. And then essentially
Yeah.
what we're doing is we're putting the addresses on there, the locations, the coffee shops,
Mm,
right? And we're essentially labeling the blockchain
mm,
to ensure that the data is there to make the right decisions. So it's a combination, which I think is so interesting and interesting
mm,
about the business. So we are using threat hunters, right? Sourced from, uh, whether they're former government, law enforcement or others who are out there creating that database. But then what we're doing, right, is using the tech. We're using
mm,
machine learning algorithms to extrapolate. So you have one address that's associated with terrorist financing. Well, we want to know all the addresses that are associated with that one. And that's when
mm.
we're using that's when really the sort of next level tech comes in to really kind of help scale that. So you're building a database not of thousands or even millions, but even more addresses from there.
When you talk about next level tech, are you referring to, say, machine learning and AI techniques being used to troll the internet, or what exactly did you mean by that reference to next level tech?
No, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think it's really building on it's all right. So we understand sort of what one address is in terms of sort of
Yeah,
the threats there.
yeah.
That's at that point we're sort of trying to understand. All right, well, what are all the addresses out there that are
Mm,
associated with it, right? Because if you are engaging with a terrorist financier, it is
mm,
unlikely that you're sort of a lawful, citizen of the crypto ecosystem. And I think we're
mm.
building out from there. So what addresses to engage with and what addresses not to. And I think that's what the technology, machine learning and other types of technology are and that enable us to do.
And could you, without sort of breaching any confidentiality, but could you just share some examples of, I don't know, some particularly complicated or particularly colorful cases that
Yeah. I mean,
TRM's analysis has been used to crack? Or
look, I think there's so many interesting examples of sort of
yeah,
blockchain tracing
hopefully
today.
none of Garo friends have been tracked by you. But
Yeah, what's interesting, and I should say, given that comment, is what we are not doing. I told you what we are doing. What we are not
yeah,
doing is saying that is Garav's
Yeah.
cryptocurrency address, right? We are not
Yeah.
labeling that with
Yeah.
individuals. What we are
Right.
doing is really labeling it with sort of what is this threat landscape,
Right.
or not. Is that an address associated with an exchange, right? Is that a Coinbase
Mm.
address? So I think that's what's important. So when we talk about cryptocurrency, you hear anonymity, and then you hear
Mm.
this sort of idea of tracing, where we sort of tear out this anonymity. It's pseudonymity, right? Pseudo anonymity, essentially. It's knowing what that address is associated with, but not knowing
Mm.
sort of the individual there. But in terms of cases, look, I think it's cool. I mean, there have been so many interesting cases made by law enforcement over the last few years. When you talk about colorful, you had this one of the sort of most interesting cases. You had this case, the Bitfinex hack occurred
Mm.
in 2016, and what was really extraordinary about that is you then saw essentially $70 million in Bitcoin was stolen from the Bitfinex exchange in 2016. And then what you saw really over the next 5 or 6 years are those funds laundered in all kinds
Mm.
of different ways through mixers and darknet markets, the use of anonymity enhanced coins, which we can talk about all these different things. And you saw really over across blockchains using programmatic
Mm.
money laundering. In other words, using computer programs to move funds quickly to obfuscate the flow of funds. But then just last year, we saw two individuals arrested in New York City, a very colorful couple. When you said colorful, it sort of always
Yeah.
brings up Bitfinex, this very colorful couple in New York City. And the case was interesting for a number of reasons. The media picked up on it because of this sort of like, she was a rapper and it was all this craziness. But
Yeah.
really, at the end of the day, it showed the power of blockchains, right? Because you had this hack in 2016, but because of
Mm.
that permanent immutable record, right, that lives on blockchains, investigators can go back and actually investigate cases that happened years ago, because every transaction is logged on an immutable ledger. And that ultimately is what allowed the government, law enforcement, to track and trace the flow of funds through these obfuscation techniques over the course of years, arrest this couple for laundering the funds, and then, essentially make the largest seizure of anything in U.S. history, because that 70 million in 2016 had grown
Mm.
to 4.2 billion by the time that ultimately this case, ultimately this arrest occurred. And the case is still
Mm.
pending, but the reality is that like the blockchain is forever. And I think that's what we're sort of understanding more and more as this as these cases develop.
Oh, that's a great line. The blockchain is forever. It sounds like a James Bond line.
Oh, I
The
love that.
blockchain is
Absolutely.
the
Yeah.
blockchain is forever. Did you say 4 billion was seized or recovered by the feds?
It's absolutely
That's an
extraordinary.
insane number, isn't it?
It
That's
is. And I know,
insane.
I know that again, like the focus is on this couple, but like
Yeah.
the largest seizure. I mean, when I was a prosecutor, we would seize oil tankers and,
Yeah.
yachts and all kinds of stuff. Like,
Yeah.
I guess it's easier to store 4.2 billion in Bitcoin than it is an oil tanker, but it's
Yeah.
really, it's staggering. And it goes
Yeah.
to really what we talked about earlier is like, look, the same qualities that make crypto such a force for good, this
Mm.
ability to move large amounts of funds fast, peer to peer, make it attractive to illicit actors who can now move more funds than ever before. But you have this
Mm.
traceability. And I think that sort of is ultimately the key differentiator.
I'd love to learn a little bit more about how that 4 billion was tracked down. Is there anything you can share with us on like how that was
Yeah, sure. Look, there's a really interesting complaint that I would encourage folks to read that was filed
Hmm.
as part of this
Okay.
case when the charges happened, for sure. But yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, one thing that really jumped out to me is that there was relatively sophisticated sort of use of different obfuscation techniques, right?
Hmm.
They use mixers, which are sort of exchanges that exist on blockchains that mix funds and send them out
Mm.
sort of, different from different users on the other end, to obfuscate the flow of funds. They move funds in and out of darknet markets, right? Which are a place that typically there are drug transactions and other types of illicit activity. They
Mm.
were almost using those as a mixer, send them in one darknet market and out sort of the other side of that. They were using
Mm.
anonymity enhanced coins, which are harder to track and trace. But again, great investigators using sophisticated tools are able to track and trace those funds, and ultimately we're able to associate them with these individuals. One thing that's really always important to point out too is, like, tools like TRM are very, very powerful and allow investigators to sort of, track and trace the flow of funds. But this is just software, right? Like, it really, how these cases really get made at the end of the day is great investigators, from places like IRS, criminal investigations, the FBI, Homeland Security, right? Because it's only one tool in the toolbox. Blockchain tracing can only get you so far. But what really made the Bitfinex case is they were able to use that blockchain tracing to get to a search warrant. And then they kicked down the door. They did a search of the residence in New York City, and they found information that was able to then link those addresses they had to the individuals, hard drives, cell phones, seed phrases that they found, pieces of paper. So it's like, it's all one part of sort of this larger puzzle, but it is sort of the next generation of financial crime investigation.
I want to bring Gaurav into the conversation now to dig maybe a little bit
more. Yeah, where have you
into
been?
TRM Labs.
I've been in waiting, my friend. I've been waiting.
Love it. Yeah.
He's been moving all his Bitcoin wallets out of your reach.
I'm changing my address as we talk quietly. But no, my God, thanks, Ronit. I mean, wow, Ari, where do I start? This is fascinating, right? I mean, this feels like Bad Boys meets Catch Me If You Can, but the crypto blockchain version of everything. I feel like,
honestly, I love the Catch Me If You Can example is really fabulous. And it's because crypto investigations, just like any financial crime investigation, it is a bit of a cat and mouse game. The bad actors will get better. There'll be better ways for them to obfuscate their transactions, but you will still have that Tom Hanks, character,
that's you. There you
developing.
Go.
Well, it's, it's honestly, it's the great investigators out there. There's a guy named Christian Chesky who leads our global investigations team at TRM. And he was the lead case agent in that Bitfinex case I described, in a case called Welcome to Video, where he used blockchain tracing to ultimately take down the largest child exploitation darknet marketplace.
Oh, wow.
For images of child exploitation. So, like, it's, there's this saying within the government, particularly places like FBI and IRS criminal investigations, every case is a financial case. Every crime is a financial crime. And the ability to track and trace funds to stop bad actors is something we've been doing for a really, really long time. This is just the next generation of it, right?
Right. And a very dear friend of mine who shall remain nameless is a white hat cybersecurity expert that actually has been working in forensics for a very long time. And a lot of his technology that he's supplied to some of the major companies in the world have been used on the side on local or cloud forensic analysis to actually close down similar names of similar circumstances, which you've done. But you're doing it in the digital side of financial. He's doing it on digital imaging and tracing of other pieces of components within that ecosystem. Very similar, right? And he told me about how his software and tools were mentioned in DEA cases and everything else, but he's not mentioned specifically, so he's very happy. But jokes aside, and this is a fascinating conversation. I want to try and go back to the origin story of TRM, because what you're doing as a company out there, building these tools, building these capabilities, but tracing capability, fighting financial crime effectively with these toolkits, you had to start from one place, and you are a company. You're not a government service which is funded by taxpayers, right? Yeah. How did that story start from a product building piece where somebody said, I'm going to build this first product and someone's going to pay me for it at TRM? How did it start?
It's an awesome story. And admittedly, it is not my story, but our co-founders, Esteban Castano and Rahul Reina, go back a long way. And what they were really trying to do was develop a blockchain-based sort of Pokemon Go type concept, right? Where NFTs would live on blockchains and it would have sort of a gamified aspect to it. And in order to do that, they were essentially mapping the blockchain at the time, which was, primarily Bitcoin, and trying to understand sort of the trying to understand the analytics piece of that. And I think what they realized very quickly from friends and others who were engaging with this game that they were building is that they had an incredible analytics tool that they were actually building, that the game was just sort of a much smaller piece of. And what they joke about is that they created a really bad game, but a really amazing analytics tool. And I think, and as they sort of developed in that journey, they realized the power of a tool like this to stop fraud and financial crime, and really set out from there, not just on a mission to build a game, but on a mission to build a safer financial system. And what was so interesting is I, met them at some point thereafter, a couple of years thereafter, and TRM was about 9 people. We're about 200 today across 20 countries. But I think sort of my part of that journey was this really cool story of, hooking up with these incredible founders, data scientists, engineers, who were really on a mission to build a safer financial system using technology. And I couldn't believe that I found a, early stage startup that could not be more aligned to this mission that I'd had in the federal government for 15 years. That is prosecuting bad actors. It's about creating policy in the illicit finance space. And that was sort of, so getting connected and kind of, look, you have a former federal prosecutor with these really just super sharp, entrepreneurs to really come together and build a special company.
That's unbelievable. From building a game platform, moving into forensic, tracking and traceability on the blockchain for financial crime. That's a huge jump. I mean, are the founders from any financial background whatsoever?
Look, definitely sort of that tech background, entrepreneurs, and I think really realizing that they had created a really extraordinary technology for this use case, anti-money laundering for crypto. Because what's so critical in that space, or really any anti-money laundering space, is data, right? In traditional financial crime, it's the same. How can we use data to inform decisions around blocking a transaction, screening a customer, right? How do we do that? And in crypto, there's a treasure trove of data, and it's harnessing the power of that data to stop bad actors and to and again to build a safer financial system. So yeah, very very just it's serendipitous when something like this happens. Esteban doesn't like this story because he's a very very humble guy, but I will never forget over 2.5 years ago. Having a conversation, well over 2.5, maybe closer to 3 years ago, having a conversation with him about his vision for building a company, and not just building a company, but really building that safer financial system. I think I got off the phone. I said to my wife, I think I just spoke to like the most thoughtful person that I've ever spoken to. And she said, to her credit, which was a crazy move at the time, you should probably go work with that person. And it was just this really, it's just been this really extraordinary journey that, I pinch myself every day that I get to be on.
That's brilliant to hear. That's a wonderful, wonderful pivot story if I've ever heard one, especially in this space. Which is
and I get to wear cool hoodies now instead of a tie,
looking
which is
good.
definitely
When
I walked out of the very conservative Treasury Department, about 3 years ago, I swore I would never wear a tie again. I have not been perfect there. I testified before Congress once. And I was at a meeting with the CFTC last week. So twice in 3 years is not terrible, right?
It's a good track record. But you find out, they move to this space where they understand they've stumbled upon an amazing application for what they built was a really bad game, as you said in your language.
Yeah. In their words, to their credit.
In their words, your defense. In their words.
Yeah.
But when you go from there, and obviously, as Ronit alluded to earlier, there's points of confidentiality. So given the perspective of what you can share with our audience, who are the first users that you can name? I mean, you don't have to name specific companies, perhaps, but maybe which were the first early adopters of those tools that you had built for TRM from a plain client perspective?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And what's so unique about this company and this technology is that there are a number of different sort of buckets of customers, and they were all sort of the earliest, same buckets are the earliest as they are today. Look,
Oh, wow.
so what's interesting is the public sector use case is very similar to the private sector use case, right? So we work with law enforcement globally. So every three-letter law enforcement in the US, entities in the UK and in APAC, and really sort of across the globe. And they're using it for sort of the sexy use case I got into a few minutes ago with Bitfinex, right? They're using it to track and trace the flow of funds in cryptocurrency to build investigations with the hope of ultimately seizing back funds. So, for example, you had this Colonial Pipeline attack on U.S. critical infrastructure. Probably the thing that sort of made ransomware, right, and cyber attacks a household conversation. Ultimately, the FBI was able to use blockchain tracing to track and trace the flow of that Bitcoin, ultimately to a wallet address that it was able to seize back. That's the sort of the law enforcement use case, and that was a relatively early use case of TRM. But similarly, now regulators globally, again, still public sector, they want to understand, all right, what are the risks in our regulated ecosystem? If you're, the Virtual Asset Regulatory Authority, VARA, in Dubai, the first ever regulator, crypto-only regulator, right? If you're the MAS in Singapore, if you're JFSA in Japan, if you're, SEC, CFTC, Treasury, all the financial regulators in the US, you want to understand what are the risks within your regulated ecosystem, right? You want to, a crypto business is looking for a license. You want to understand what are the risks of that business. And then finally, you have a financial institution, Citi, right, is at some part of its crypto journey. It wants to understand sort of how can I engage with this technology safely, So it is using a tool like TRM to screen transactions, like we talked about earlier, to monitor, to do transaction monitoring, to screen wallet addresses. And cryptocurrency businesses are doing that as well. And everything from NFT issuers and marketplaces to DeFi protocols to large exchanges. They are, TRM is their anti-money laundering for crypto. So that's sort of a long-winded, and I apologize, but there are so many different buckets of customers and use cases here. And those were relatively early on. That was also true, but it's sort of grown from there, obviously.
When you have product that you're building and the adopters are from probably the biggest impact institutions, first, the ones that you're talking about, public sector, large financial transaction companies that are looking at participating in the space of digital money as it is today on cryptocurrency and blockchain, rather than just transferring funds from financial institution to financial institution. Is there a point at which your tool sets can be then consumed by individuals, perhaps, or smaller institutions like universities, perhaps, which were affected by ransomware, or perhaps individuals that have, their accounts hacked and held to ransom? Is it available for those also at a smaller level, or is it still at a very macro level for people to adopt at larger?
Yeah, it's an awesome question, and it's definitely a mix. Look, I think that, obviously individuals who are losing funds. There are, folks out there that do investigations, that have open source tools, right? What's so interesting about cryptocurrency, right, is that you don't need TRM in order to follow the funds. The nature of open blockchains really allow anyone visibility on financial flows using sort of open source tools like Etherscan and others. And what's so cool is, you go to crypto Twitter, right? You see sort of like, these, Twitter sleuths, who are everywhere from, professionals, professional investigators or to, folks in their, mom's basement who are able to track and trace the flow of funds on open blockchains with tools. So, TRM is sort of that next level of sophistication, right? Where you're actually labeling addresses, where you're providing threat finance information to the blockchain. But there are so many ways where you can do this without sort of super sophisticated tools. So typically we're serving sort of the larger, not just institutions, but law enforcement and others. But there are definitely sort of investigators that are out there tracking and tracing funds for individuals. But there are, like you said, there are so many use cases. One thing that's interesting is you mentioned, a hospital or university that's attacked by ransomware. We have an incident response component. So we have a team. I mentioned Chris Jancheski earlier. Chris leads that team. And that team also does incident response. So pretty much we've been involved in many of sort of the largest hacks over the last, couple of years, where we will, work with a protocol, we will work with an exchange, we will work with sort of another entity that's been hacked to track and trace the flow of funds, to coordinate with law enforcement, and kind of deal with that incident response piece. So it's not necessarily that these institutions would be needing to use a tool like TRM, but they would certainly engage us to help with the response. Oftentimes we are working with sort of a more traditional incident response or type of entity where we're doing the crypto tracing. But we're certainly sort of working with entities that have been attacked.
When you're at the size you are now, you're no longer a startup. You're talking about from 9 people to 220 countries. You're now a very strong and mature company, which has a very, again, strong and mature product that you serve in different various silos to different people and institutions. When you're looking at building the next product or lines, is it inbound? Is it organic? Because the space moves so quickly and changes so quickly that the kind of incident threats or the kind of responses that your clients have for the need for protection or incidents that may happen feed into your product development? Or are you producing product ahead of time because you are predicting the next set of weaknesses or exploits that people will try and take advantage of from the ecosystem as it's evolving and changing?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. First of all, I definitely take issue with the first point. We are absolutely still a startup. I would even say early stage. And
to all his investors.
Well, no, even beyond that. Look, 200. I mean, what are you guys, right? Like, I definitely early stage, and I think it's not only just numbers wise, we're certainly that we're an early stage startup, right? But I think that also it's the mentality. I'm a big Hamilton fan, and I talk about being young, scrappy, and hungry all the time. It is my favorite quote. And it's sort of how how I try to be in my engagement in the space. It's how I want TRM to be at all times. But I think that, like, to your question, the decisions we make around what to build are really driven by our clients. And I know it's probably maybe trite on some level to say that, but it's really, really true at TRM. Like, we're constantly getting feedback from, law enforcement investigators saying, hey, if I was able to do, X, then I'd be able to do my job more efficiently or better. And we're almost constantly building that way. So we're hearing sort of what are the trends, what are the new typologies that you're seeing if you're law enforcement, if you're a regulator, if you're a financial institution, and we're building that. So I'd say it's sort of, when you talk about sort of being an early stage startup, when you talk about being young, scrappy, and hungry, we're constantly reacting to sort of what our customers' needs are, what we're hearing from the market in terms of what they want, and we're building that. There are certainly times where, we're out there saying, all right, we think this is what the next thing is going to be, but it's really more reacting to clients. Let me give you a great example. We just built something called TRM Tactical, and it's because what you're seeing a lot of times is agents in the field. I talked about the Bitfinex case where you kick down the door, you execute a search warrant. Well, those are law enforcement who aren't familiar with crypto tracing, who maybe don't have access to a tool like TRM. But what they do have is access to a cell phone. So what TRM Tactical allows is for them to find a piece of paper on the ground with a seed phrase, pop that seed phrase or that alphanumeric address into TRM on their phone, and get off and running to at least sort of have a lead or understand a little bit more about that information. So what we heard from the market is like, hey, people need something on a search warrant. They need access to a tool, when they're just, when they make an arrest or when they're, and so we built a mobile first tool to allow law enforcement to engage that way. So that's the kind of thing we're doing, but that is in direct response to something that we heard from our clients on a pretty regular basis. Like, hey, this is something that would be really cool to have. So we built it.
I imagine that, with all the feedback that you're getting and the work that you do genuinely started from traceability, how much of your work now is in preventative measures or training, perhaps, in, explaining to institutions for themselves to be resilient to vulnerability or exploits?
It's a great question. So like, from the vulnerability and exploit standpoint, there are kind of two pieces to what we've seen. Look, I mean, 2022, as you know, is a record year for hacks. We saw about, according to TRM, I think we saw about 3.7 billion in funds stolen in cyber attacks from the
Wow.
crypto ecosystem. And the vast majority of that was in DeFi. So bridges and protocols, right? We saw the largest hack in 2022 against the Ronin bridge, which is part of the play to earn game Axie Infinity. We saw over 600 million stolen from that bridge. So it's a real problem. But essentially, there's two pieces of that. One that we sort of work on, and one we don't as much. The first is cybersecurity, right? It's so important that we harden cybersecurity in our space. As we're building, that people are building out cybersecurity controls to stop those attacks from happening in the first place. That's obviously not the focus of TRM. Our focus is to make the money laundering as hard as possible, right? To create friction for bad actors who are trying to launder those funds. And the hope is that if we can make that very, very difficult, those cyber attacks will happen less frequently. So that's something that's the piece that we're working on all the time when it comes to sort of cyber attacks. But really, at the end of the day, we're a software company. We've built a tool that can be used to track and trace funds, that can be used for anti-money laundering, less so sort of that cybersecurity piece necessarily.
Super, super interesting. I think with the space evolving at the rate that it is, we talked about regulation and we talked about regulators and we talked about infrastructure that's available from our financial institution, regulatory piece globally. There's no unified standards. The methodology is still taking shape and frame. How much of a part are you playing in shaping policy, advocacy, endorsement of the space to actually become a new channel for digitization of money, as opposed to the current existing infrastructure, which is widespread, from a safety or an adoption policy point of view?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I definitely spend a lot of my time working with policymakers globally on these types of issues. And you're absolutely right. Look, I think, I'm not naive enough to believe we'll ever have sort of global standards or global regulation in the cryptocurrency space. But I do think there's globally starting to build sort of more consistency, at least. You look at places like I mentioned, Dubai, you look at places like Singapore, you look at the UK and the EU, and you're seeing some consistencies develop across these different jurisdictions. And I think that's actually been playing out very rapidly in 2023. I think that's less true in the US today. You still have a lot of regulatory action. We have more and more disagreement between and amongst regulators. We don't have any like legislation at all when it comes to the crypto space. So I think the US, we're still seeing this evolve, and we'll see. Right now it's characterized mostly by that sort of regulatory enforcement action than it is by sort of legislation or legal frameworks. But where we or I or can be most useful at TRM is what we want to do is inform regulators globally, policymakers about the unique qualities of blockchains, right? That allow potentially regulation to be different. When we're talking in the old system, in sort of traditional financial system, you have these siloed intermediaries that are sending reports to their regulator, essentially with these walled gardens that no one else ever sees. But in crypto, you have full visibility on financial flows in real time on open blockchains. So I think we can regulate better and differently than we ever have before based on the qualities of blockchains. And I think our tool can be very helpful in sort of demonstrating that, hey, you can see, you do have data that can help inform decision making and policy making. And that's really, as opposed to, you mentioned advocating, it's like it's less advocating and really more educating, but something we're definitely spending a lot of time on.
How many years since TRM started till now? How old is the company?
The company itself is about 5 or 6 years old, but really sort of, I'd say, over the last, three or so years, we've become sort of much more active, moving from that stage of really building to obviously always continuing to build the tool, the tech, but now to sort of like a very sort of much a grow to market growth. We've seen really, really rapid growth. As I said, we went from 9 when I joined about 2.5 years ago to about 200 today. So it's really sort of the last couple of years we've seen tremendous growth, but this is a company that's been building for a number of years.
Wow. I think, in the time span that you spent at the company, 2.5 years, and the growth that's happened is indicative of the requirement of the industry and this pace at which it's growing and changing. What do you think it's going to look like if you draw a line forward 2.5 years from now? Can you paint a picture of what you think TRM looks like?
I said I would come on only if you would ask the easy questions. That is the heart. I think about this all the time. I think this space is going to look dramatically different,
right,
over the course of the next few years than it does today. What I'm excited about is payments. And I said this recently at something and someone said, no one is excited about payments.
You're right. No one is excited about payments. I think I'm the only guy in this room that's ever like this virtual room.
I have to tell you,
payments.
It's kind of a funny story. Actually, I was in New York and I was on this panel at Christie's talking about NFTs and sort of the regulatory sort of frameworks around NFTs. And it was like the coolest crowd you've ever seen in your life. It was like artists and like rappers and like athletes and like, and I was like, definitely like, I'm the former prosecutor, like least cool guy in the room. Right. And I start talking about how excited I am about payments. And our marketing folks, when I got back, they said, yeah, you did a great job, but like, dude, like payments are not that exciting, like especially in that group. But I think what I'm excited about is kind of moving from, like crypto as really like kind of the speculative, thing, to really the power and promise of being able to transact peer-to-peer globally in a seamless, less expensive way. And I think that's really the promise of the technology, is this ability to sort of reach the unbanked corners of the world, to fund, humanitarian aid in Ukraine. I think that there's all kinds of really interesting use cases today that we're only going to see sort of grow and expand. But I think once we see this for payments is when things will really blow up. People ask all the time, like, so what's the coin? What are people going to use? And the answer is, look, I don't know. But I do know that like Amazon is going to accept payments at some point, right? Walmart, like the biggest players in retail and around the globe are going to engage with this technology. And I think when that happens, and it'll be for payments, that really will sort of move from where we are today to sort of this much more mainstream, like truly new financial system.
You're preaching to the choir. and by the way, I'm happy to go toe to toe with your marketing folks and have a conversation about this. But I digress, and I'm sure we'll connect again later after this call. So much to ask, so much to understand, and such an exciting space. I mean, it's evolving. I'm sure we'll have you back on the show. But before we do anything anymore or move into that space, I'm going to hand back to Ronit.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Ari.
Really fun, guys. Yep.
Maybe we could just talk a little bit more about payments to wrap up.
Yes,
this is not
give me more. I like it.
This is not Sotheby's or Christie's, right? There's no rappers in the room.
Let's go.
No rappers in the room.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're all listening. They're all listening, but
they were listening. I actually, it's funny enough, I happened to be on with the U.S. congressman, was also on my panel. So I feel like, maybe I wasn't totally the most least interesting. Did I just say that? Was that recorded?
We'll make sure that in the highlights reel we add that in, just like prominently.
Nice.
So on payments, were you referring to just use of blockchain-based money? So like, you can have DLT-based CBDCs or DLT-based stablecoins that could be bank-backed, or even tokenized deposits, I think is the official term that banks prefer. Are you thinking of that? Or are you thinking of, I don't know, Bitcoin and other public cryptocurrencies?
I think it's a mix. And again, like this is just wild speculation, which is something I tend to avoid. But I think it's a mix. I think Bitcoin, obviously, because of the store of value, sort of other aspects of what really Bitcoin has become. I'm not sure Bitcoin is going to be sort of the featured cryptocurrency for payments. But yeah, I think we're talking about a mix. Every country in the world is talking CBDC, and I know there's different views on ultimately where CBDC is going to land, but it's going to land somewhere. So you're going to have that. You're going to have central banks. You're going to have stable coins. I think the power and promise of private stable coins is really truly extraordinary. People talk about the reach of the dollar, right? And sort of this dollar dominance, right? You see 99% of fiat-backed stable coins are US dollar based.
Yeah,
That's going
yeah.
to be a really important tool of US foreign policy as we sort of evolve, right? I think there's, I joked about, Amazon, is there Amazon coin, right? Like I do 60% of my shopping on Amazon, right? Like wouldn't it be that's, will that be something
Yeah.
that is going to be important? So I think the answer is it's going to be a mix. And I know everyone wants to take you have your Bitcoin maximalist, you have your CBDC crowd, you have your stablecoin. I do really believe they're probably ultimately looking on a mix. But to your original question, I think that the power of the blockchain or blockchains really will enable all kinds of different technology for payments.
Hey, Ron,
It
do you want to
is.
start a fund for that? You can call it the Garv and
Whoever
Bonnet
takes the
coin, and
friction,
everyone can do it, and it's powered by and verified by TRM, so it's safe.
whoever takes
No
the
disputes
friction
and
out of
chargebacks. No disputes and chargebacks.
It's funny, but like I'm in, like whoever takes the friction out of that process, I think there's a really extraordinary business there.
I'll be right back.
It is ironic, isn't it, that our friends who are Bitcoin maxis or the crypto bros, they go on and go on and on and on about the decline of the US dollar. And Gareth and I know all about that. And meanwhile, 98% or 99% of stable coins are dollar denominated.
It's super interesting.
There's a super irony in that, isn't there? That
it's interesting. I mentioned in Congress, and that was exactly the issue they asked me to testify to, is essentially sort of like alternative payment rails and national security. And a big question was, is crypto sort of a threat to sort of the US sanctions regime? And part of my argument was that, like, instead of focusing on that, we should be focusing on the way to sort of harness the power of the technology that's in the US today and how we're exporting our values. And I thought that, Circle USDC is an incredible example of how we're able to kind of still export the dollar. People around the world are. And I think the other piece that's really important that people forget is the US, is still a leader of people engaging with this technology, right? There are more people in the US engaging with this technology than anywhere in the world. And I think that it's so important that we continue to build here. But yeah, the stablecoin point is really, really important.
Maybe just to wrap this all up, and I know this is a very hard to answer question, but it's probably a series of questions. But given that the US has all this talent, as you've talked about in this space, the US has the cultural weight as well. So part of this ecosystem is about programming and coding. Part of it is about libertarian philosophies. Part of it is about, I don't know, programmability and doing stuff with software. And part of it is just vibes and vibing. And
yeah,
the US does very well in all of those. Very few countries like tick every single box, and the US does it. And yet we're in, I don't know if we're in the, as the Americans say, early innings or middle innings or late innings of this quite, I don't know if it's coordinated. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but it's quite a broad-based, I kind of want to use my words carefully, broad-based focus on this space, particularly the public cryptocurrency space. Just in the last 24 hours of this recording, we've had another major centralized exchange in the crosshairs of one regulatory agency. We've had loads more in the last few weeks, last few months, from listed companies to, offshore companies in the crosshairs of US regulators. The banking system seems, more nervous than before about interacting with these players. So you're sitting in the US, you've worked in government, you've been a prosecutor. What is going on, Ari? Is this like some sort of, is there like a story here, a coordinated narrative? I mean,
yeah, it's a very, very difficult moment. It's interesting. I have referred to sort of this space generally as sort of pre-first inning, to your baseball analogy.
Pre-first inning.
Pre-first inning. Yeah, I think we are very, very early. But I do think we're seeing a really a very, very difficult moment when it comes to sort of the US regulatory space in particular. And it's interesting, we went around the world earlier and talked about places like Dubai and Singapore and Hong Kong and the UK and the EU. all places that have really focused on building out a framework, a legal and regulatory framework. And I think the problem is in the US, you don't have that. So what you have is, disparate regulators all sort of planting a flag, CFTC, SEC, Treasury and others. And you don't see sort of, there's no rules, right? There's no rules. You talk about baseball, right? There are no rules in which to play this game. And I think what you see regulators doing what they do, right? Bring actions and make determinations without any guidance. And this is not at all to excuse the regulatory action, quite the opposite. It's that we need clarity for this space in order to kind of stop this from happening.
All right, all I'm going to say is I'm going to say two things, and then I'm going to mic drop, and I'm going to bounce. I'm going to jump out of this, which will accelerate exactly what you're going to talk about. China, CDBCs. I'm out.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's interesting. It's like, is this a digital space race or is this something else? And I think that's kind of an open question.
It's gonna happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that these issues are wrapped up in national security, right? And it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out. But I think sadly, it's not going to get much better anytime soon in the US because the political environment, I do not think, is necessarily ripe to get the type of, MiCA style framework, right, for digital assets or something to kind of bring the space some clarity. And don't get me wrong, I think there's lots of sort of potential issues with any framework, whether it's VARA's rulebook or MiCA, but at least there's kind of rules of the road to play by at this point.
It's going to be, what's that ancient Chinese curse? May you live in interesting times. Ari, may you live in interesting times.
We do. And it's, and it's it is up to us to work together on these things.
Indeed. Thank you so much for joining us.
My absolute pleasure. You guys are awesome.
Ari.
And looking forward to next time.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Take care.